Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Cirrus Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, we had a very interesting and enlightening event take place where the Polish foreign minister was caught with his pants down and spilled all the beans. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And wow, this is a bombshell video.
Yeah, well, first off, likewise, Ken, and appreciate you joining me. It's always good that we do these things together. So, yeah, what this relates to is I'm sure people have heard these Russian pranksters called Vovan and Lexus. They're always interviewing Western people and tripping them up and getting them to make statements. And they probably then absolutely regret the fact that these statements are being made. But they obviously ask a lot of leading questions, and they did this of Sikorsky, and frankly, from our perspective, it vindicates so much of what we've been saying largely uniquely for 2.5 years regarding the West's involvement in Ukraine, regarding the West's appetite to join a war in Ukraine directly, etc., etc. And we'll go through the bits and chew it over, but it absolutely proves our point unequivocally, because Sikorsky thinks he's talking to Poroshenko. Everyone remembers who Poroshenko is. He's now the opposition in Ukraine. He may, in the future, end up as Ukraine president. Again, I don't know. Time will tell. But I don't want to go through absolutely everything that Sikorsky said, but we'll cover the main points. And he talks about the fact, effectively, of this whole story that has been doing the rounds. Remember, repeatedly, Poland, or statements were attributed that Poland was going to send 300,000 forces into Ukraine. They were going to join the war directly and fight the Russians. And that was a big escalation. And everyone kept saying this was going to happen. Well, what a surprise. Sikorsky says, look, here's the deal. We will train forces in Poland, maybe a brigade or two, no problem, but there will never be Polish forces fighting in Ukraine against Russia. And of course, that's exactly the point we made all along. I mean, irrefutably the case. And therefore, we kept saying, just because you hear words coming out of Western country, certain Western players, doesn't mean it's reality. Take a lot of what's said with a huge dose of salt. And this is another example of that. Another point worth making is he talked about NATO being hypocritical, because in one sense it was saying once you win the war, you can join NATO, meaning Ukraine. Also that some were using this sort of like a sword of Damocles with Russia over Ukraine and NATO membership as a bargaining chip, going, well, you know, if you leave Ukraine and surrender all the territory you claim is now part of Russia, well, it's not it, then Ukraine won't be part of NATO. And if you decide otherwise, then whatever's left of Ukraine will become part of NATO. I mean, the fact they even think that's a reality, and that wasn't, by the way, Sikorsky's perspective. He said certain Western nations, but again, these are people, nations expressing their opinion in NATO. There's no joined up thinking. Not everybody's on the same page. But another point he made that's absolutely crystal clear: there is no willingness whatsoever for anyone in the West to have a war with Russia directly. This is an absolute red line. No one's going to cross it again. It's a point we've made repeatedly, and I've taken an awful lot of stick about it, and people getting very angry, saying this was a very naive assessment because it was very obvious that the United States wants to go to war with Russia. Well, it absolutely isn't, because as we keep saying, that results in World War III. World War III results in the total annihilation and destruction of all Western countries. No one in the West wants that to happen. And that should be really the statement of the obvious, because why would they? Because it's not about mutually assured destruction. It's about the West being destroyed. They also made a point, and we said this at the time, and I'll stop after this point, Ken, and then you can come in and then we'll just take it from there. But remember all the statements Macron was coming out with about You know, we're going to stick French forces in Ukraine. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Of course, he never did any of it, which we said at the time he wouldn't. We said at the time this was meaningless rhetoric. And effectively, Sikorsky says, well, we kind of played along with what he was doing because, in essence, it's making Putin wonder what we're going to do. So he said, we're not going to say what we'll never do, meaning we're not going to say we're not going to invade. We're just going to try and, you know, unnerve him, make him have to think 5 different ways about what we might do and what we might not do. And everybody knows, of course, that trying to play mind games with Putin is a total waste of time. But there's some really key points that we've been hammering for a long time. And Sikorsky's just demonstrated it unequivocally, precisely the points we were making, which is why I'm never going to back down on this. I'm really feel that I have to make this point. When there's something that has to be said, that's the reality, that it's the genuine position to take, then we're always going to take it, even though we were in a popularity contest of one, effectively. I'm not saying uniquely, because we don't know every opinion anyone's ever expressed. It's impossible to know that. But they're very key points which absolutely supports our stance on what the West is doing, what the West will never do, and why largely a lot of the West is just words, people expressing opinions, and not opinions shared by the collective. But, you know, if we can undermine Putin with a psyop or two, why should we get in the way of the likes of Macron?
Yeah, as you noted in the past, you know, the clickbait of, oh, World War III, this is all coming to a culmination. The fact of the matter is that from the very start, the use of Ukraine was for alternative purposes. The U.S., obviously, we had the Biden administration was tied into it with certain things. We had, you know, the corporations had interests in Ukraine, and even so, we're seeing that as well. You have to wonder what the U.S.'s true goal in extending and supporting this conflict really is. But with that being said, everything you laid out and the validation from the Polish foreign minister that this whole thing really has just been more hyperbole than actual action and desire and crossing of red lines. Blinken is, there's news coming out from credible, you know, or at least semi-credible mainstream media sources, of course, that President Biden is, and do we know it's really him, tomorrow going to announce that he is allowing Ukraine to use long-range ballistic missiles in Russia. Well, this, of course, from a policy standpoint, would be in opposition to what the Polish Minister Sikorsky said. But likely, it's just the U.S., which cannot afford another Afghanistan. They cannot afford another Iraq. They cannot afford another loss on the world stage in regards to the hegemony that they want to show the entire world that they're in control and they can do anything. But the reality is that announcement is just probably just to appease certain parties. You know, and he brought the minister from Britain along with him. And they're the only ones in NATO who are actually talking, you know, making these outlandish statements or these outlandish policies, and I put that in quotes, at this point in time. Because as we mentioned, I think a week ago in a podcast, Russia is at the point of crossing over the last truly defended area in Ukraine. After that, it's a clean open shot to Kiev if they so desired. So anything that would be potentially like another Kursk, sending ballistic missiles deep into Russia to scare them or send a message, will have zero outcome to the overall end of this conflict. And the end of the conflict is going to be when Ukraine finally gives an unconditional surrender and Russia says, okay, we're dictating terms. The West and NATO have nothing to say about it. Here's what's going to happen. End of story.
Yeah, okay. I think we'll carry on the discussion about Lammy and Blinken a bit later, Ken, as well, because we need to finish all the points that Sikorsky made because they're all relevant. And I don't want to kind of lose the thread of that before we go into a bit more detail. Okay, if that's
Gotcha.
right. So he then goes on about, well, he gets asked by these pranksters, what about Ukraine and EU membership? Well, that's a long way away. You have to go through stages. But you can see Poland's thinking going, well, once Ukraine becomes a full member, this balance of power in the EU shifts because then Ukraine and Poland collectively would have more votes than anyone else, more members of parliament than Germany. And you can see the reasoning and thinking that Poland thinks, eventually we're going to be ruling the roost in Europe. And that's confirmation of the fact that, that's exactly what Poland wants to do. And so therefore you can see again how there's games being played. Again, there's no joined up thinking. The idea that, certain entities control certain things, absolutely not. It's a hugely fluid situation. And Poland thinks along with Ukraine, and I'm sure it thinks it can form a commonwealth with Lithuania again. And all of a sudden, Poland's the biggest power in Europe. And this is an expression of that. And there's no doubt that will cause enormous consternation inside Germany when they hear statements like that. Because at the end of the day, they can say things publicly, but privately, these kind of comments are very, very damaging. So that in of itself shows, from Poland's perspective, there's an ulterior motive to getting Ukraine into the EU, but the admission is it could take a decade. And it probably never happened because by the time it could happen, even if it will, the European Union as it is now will cease to exist anyway. But again, it's another point where everything is myriads of shades of grey. There's no black and white. There's no these people are controlling this entity or someone else is controlling that. Absolutely not the case. And Poland clearly has designs in that regard.
What's really fascinating in all of this is if Poland is coming out and saying this, at least the Polish foreign minister, what actually have they been talking about amongst themselves at closed door NATO meetings? Because obviously there are discussions that they have. Maybe certain powers like Germany and France, Britain, of course, the United States, are coming out and saying, we're going to stand in solidarity and this is what we're going to do. Boom, 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 boom. And it seems like that was the case early on in the conflict. You had Stoltenberg doing his rhetoric and we're going to stay to the end and yada, yada, yada. The U.S. standing behind it. But now, as things have progressed and things have really not been in NATO's favor, something like this, I guarantee, was not discussed. And Poland probably didn't broach it at any point with the other nations within NATO in these closed door meetings. So with that being the case, how many other different, let's just say, sovereign policies that weren't shared with each other, et cetera, for whatever reason, is also being fomented at those local levels. So you have a massive division in NATO that was held together by the glue of the Damocles sword of the United States over NATO. But now, since the U.S. has proven itself to be nothing more than a paper tiger, you have Poland coming out and saying, hey, this is our opportunity to regain former glory while Germany is delving, disintegrating into economic and social unrest. And France is off on its own thing. They have their own political problems. Poland standing strong, and they see an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we come on to the next point, which just proves even more we talk about trust between the United States and the likes of Poland. Now Blinken rolls into Poland today and it all looks on face value. We're all friends or allies, you're going to support us on our eastern flank because of the mythical threat posed by Belarus and Russia. But then Sikorsky gets asked the question about nuclear weapons, and he's asked, and he comes out and says, well, all these discussions currently is unhelpful for Poland. It's not going to happen. The President Duda must stop talking about it. And they ask, well, why? Well, Duda wants to attract attention to himself because he's only got a year left in office. And, and then he gets asked, well, does Poland want nuclear weapons? Well, they don't want American warheads on their soil because they're not under Polish control. And therefore they said, yeah, but if you have these weapons and Russia attacks you, he said, well, the weapons won't be able to be used by Poland. We can't do anything about it. And then he let slip about the fact, remember in the early 90s, Ukraine had nuclear weapons, but they couldn't use them. So that's admitting what was always been said all along, that those weapons were Russian weapons, which they were from the Soviet era. But what does this tell us? Poland doesn't trust the United States. What it's basically saying is, even if it's completely paranoid that Russia's going to attack it, but let's say Russia was going to attack Poland, and there are plenty of people in Poland who believe this, what they're effectively saying, well, there's no point having nuclear weapons because the Americans will not allow us to use them. So what's that saying? That's effectively admitting that Article 5 is meaningless, that the United States isn't really an ally of Poland because it never wants to go to war with Russia. So it's not going to come in and go, I know, we'll let you fire American nuclear warheads at Russia from Polish soil, because then we're at war with Russia, meaning the United States. Again, this is exactly the point we've been making all the way along, that this idea that there's all this joined up thinking, all this idea that everyone's on side. So you will see these meetings between Blinken and Duda and whoever else and Tusk and whatever, and it all looks great on the surface, but underneath, clearly all is not well in the relationship between Poland and the United States in this case. And this is another great example, because you basically say, I don't want these weapons because we have no control over them. Then basically what you're saying is, well, we don't believe the US will use them against Russia in any context. And of course, unless Russia bombs the United States, which it's never going to do, and there's never going to be any retaliatory strike by the United States on Russia.
I think that about covers it in a nutshell, especially since the fact that when you take a look at where the U.S. has been focusing on, they put more of their focus on what's going on in the Middle East over the past few months than they have over Ukraine. It's almost like recently we had Lindsey Graham go over there and do his thing like McCain used to do. But that's a useful idiot sending him out there to try to, hype up, motivation to keep the thing going. But there really hasn't been any serious agency coming from the U.S. to try to really win this conflict. I truly think the U.S. has come to the realization we just want to stretch it out as long as we can so it doesn't seem as a defeat, but we know inevitably it's over.
Yeah, and you come back to the point, why is the United States still in the war? Because it needs an exit strategy. So it doesn't look like it's to blame for why Ukraine lost the war, because that would massively damage the United States' credibility on the world stage. It would end NATO, because Europe would look at this and go, well, you can't defend Ukraine. You clearly can't defend us. And if Poland thinks what it thinks about nuclear weapons, what does that tell us? It tells us that in reality, behind all the public facade, privately, everyone knows the United States will do nothing to defend them. This is probably also why all this paranoia they've been fed about Russia invading just makes things worse for these countries like the Baltic republics, and also, of course, those in Poland who believe this. And just one final point I think worth making, Sikorsky gets asked about Nord Stream. And he says, well, whoever did it did a good job. he also said the Americans had advanced knowledge of it, but they didn't stop it. And he said, we have our suspicions. We read the newspapers, and then they get prompted saying, well, the German paper said it was Ukraine. And he didn't say anything, but maybe, that's what he's trying to infer. It was the Ukrainians. Now, people immediately look at this and go, well, he knows the Americans did it. Well, not necessarily. I mean, we should never make assumptions about what these politicians believe to be responsible or not responsible. Never make any assumptions about what these people are capable of doing, capable of knowing, because it will disappoint you greatly. They're not often what we perceive them to be. And he might legitimately think quite that it is the Ukrainians behind it. He may actually just be, it might be bravado when he knows the United States is responsible, but why say the US had advanced knowledge of it and didn't stop it? In a sense, that's kind of throwing the US under the bus as well. And okay, this is only with Poroshenko. He doesn't know who he's really talking to, but that is an extremely interesting statement, an interesting way of kind of not saying explicitly, but saying we have our suspicions. We read newspapers. Well, none of the newspapers have accused the United States. Well, okay, not in the West anyway, but certainly they're accusing the Ukrainians, and they're trying to drag the Poles into it as well. But in any way, shape, or form, he is not necessarily being as forthcoming as he could be, because maybe in reality he doesn't know either. And people will say that's impossible. Well, it's not impossible. Again, understand how the world really operates, and not this perception of how people think the world operates, which is largely being driven by people who frankly don't know anything about how the world operates, because they wouldn't make statements as they do as to how somehow there's all these group of people who push chess pieces all around boards and make all these decisions and make things happen in the world. It simply is not like that. And in essence, the statements that Sikorski's made goes a long way to supporting the viewpoint that there isn't all this joined up thinking. It's not as clear cut as people would perceive it to be. And just because on the surface everyone appears to agree with the United States doesn't mean in reality underneath it all they do agree with what the US policies are.
Yeah, because even within NATO, just like within the EU, there are powerful countries that have a much bigger voice and much bigger stick controlling policy, and there are smaller ones that try to are just happy to eat the crumbs at the table. And Poland is one of those in both instances, EU and NATO. But in the end, that all of the smaller countries are vying to get up to the big boy side of the table. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for.
Yeah, it was just a couple of points before we finish, Ken. A statement that has to be made, and it won't be a shock to everyone. NATO is just a psyop, in the sense that NATO is constructed to control Europe, to allow the military-industrial complex to sell a load of arms to countries, to convince them all that Russia's the bogeyman who's out to get them, who wants to go to war with them, create another Soviet Union. And if you convince certain nations enough, because of the fact of what the Soviet Union was and how they were under Soviet control, it's very easy to make them malleable to your perspective. But the fact is, the Ukraine war risks destroying that psyop and making nations begin to question what the US is prepared to do, what the US's role really is, how the US is conducting itself, and that, apart from anything else, is another reason why the US is extremely worried about just walking away from the war. It would like to do so. But the other problem, of course, is the whole purpose of the Ukraine war was not to go to war with Russia. It was, they thought, we'll crush Russia very quickly. Russia will get rid of Putin. It will become malleable to unipolarity. We'll drag it back into our world. And that's the end of multipolarity, because the Chinese then will just be out on a limb because they need Russian energy. They'll have to toe the line. they'll need Russian this, they need the Russian resources, etc. And if Russia is under our control effectively, then so's China. So that's the end of multipolarity. That was the point. So therefore, all these statements, no doubt, when carefully crafted things were said just prior to Russia invading Ukraine about Ukraine having NATO membership, and that very careless statement that was made about Ukraine and nuclear weapons, it was part of a psyop. So Russia would invade Ukraine and then be destroyed. Of course, Russia took the bait, but Russia wasn't destroyed, and the rest history. And just one small point regarding Blinken and Lamy's visit to Ukraine, which all the headlines say one thing, reality says something else, because the devil, as they say, is always in the detail. What actually is going to transpire from this? What does it mean? What are the range of these missiles? Are there any preconditions as to if you're going to strike Russian targets, you can only strike certain targets? And don't forget one thing. And I made this point, there's a huge schism developing because the State Department is keen to give Kiev more support. Why? Because they face political ruin if this war ends. But on the flip side, you have the Pentagon and Langley who are saying this cannot happen. We cannot allow this to happen. This is why Austin made the statement he did, basically going, well, Russia's moved all its bases out of the range of these missiles. There's no point giving it to them. Kiev has other missiles and things it can use, drones, etc., if it wants to target things. Basically going, we don't want to get involved. Do you know why? Because it's back to Sikorsky's point. We never want to be seen to be directly in conflict with Russia. The risk is that causes that problem. So if the Pentagon and Langley feel that, and the State Department feels otherwise, then the State Department makes statements and just gives them, blanket coverage of striking anything inside Russia. That is a huge schism that hasn't been there for 2.5 years. Really, in essence, that's the big talking point. What's changed? And does it mean that change is permanent? Probably not. And then if you have the administration basically in defiance of the Pentagon and the CIA, that has massive ramifications for the future. And I think that's the point to finish this on, because that's really the statement. This schism that clearly could be that's been simmering for a while, could erupt completely. And then you might have a massive internal problem inside the United States. At the moment, Russia seems to be, well, we don't care if you do this. You've been using these Storm Shadow missiles inside Ukraine. They've been using the ATACMS as well. Well, okay, if you want to start targeting things inside Russia, well, you have anyway. So, but it makes great headlines and it makes great statements for people to say on YouTube, because they get people watching and they get lots of advertising revenue. That's the problem with models like that. It attracts entertainment. And again, in a world of many myriads of shades of grey, it's always about being informed.
Yeah, and your last points make for a perfect segue for what we will be talking about in our next podcast, that Russian-China BRICS coalition, that is what the multipolar world is all about. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here, thank you for being a part of the Sirius Report community. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.